All right, now it's time to do our next section of material following evolution. We're going to do this section, I recall, as the Meet the Players section of the course, where we introduce all the different chordate organisms and talk about their primary features, how they're similar, different, and so on. So we're going to start by going back to looking at urochordates, cephalochordates, craniates, and so on. So we're going to identify some features and talk briefly about what some of these are that we may not be all that familiar with in the chart. So let's start by talking about how cephalochordates are different from the urochordates. We're going to identify a couple of important features right here. First of all, we have the beginning of something called the somite. So cephalochordates have somites and segmental nerves. Somites and segmental nerves. So first, let's take a little moment to explain what those features are. When an embryo is developing, right down the middle of the animal's dorsal structure here, we get the formation of the nerve tube. So this represents my nerve tube here in blue. And underneath of that would be a structure we call the notochord. So the notochord would be deep to that. I'll put it in red right down the middle here. So it's got a notochord, it's got a nerve cord right down the middle. To either side of that notochord, we have some special mesodermal tissues that develop in segmental blocks. Now this in a cephalochordate and amphioxus will simply become bundles of muscle in the body wall that allow it to wiggle the way that it does. And we see this basic arrangement in all of the other higher groups of chordates all the way through. And when we were in our early developmental stages, we had these somite blocks forming in the mesodermal tissue, lateral to the notochord, all the way down the body. So these are somites. Now, like I said, this becomes muscle bundles in the amphioxus and the cephalochordate group. And even when you look at fish, when you look at a fillet of fish, you see this banding pattern in the muscle in the fish fillet. And that's derived from these somites that develop here. Urochordates don't have that segmental arrangement. Cephalochordates and then craniates do have that. The segmental nerves, it just stands to reason that each of these muscle bundles out here would be supplied by a nerve from that nerve tube out there. So there's innervation that goes into each of the somites, from the neural tube to the somites, segmental nerves to the somite bundles that are growing out there. So we have segmental nerves, we have the development of somites in the cephalochordata for the first time. Okay, we have our somites and segmental nerves giving rise to the cephalochordate group in there, and then next, above that, right here, this entire group from here on up we're going to refer to as craniates. Craniata subphylum we're talking about here. Some of the features of the craniata: the existence of cartilage that helps us to form that cranium. We call it the cranial skeleton. We also see something called neural crest tissue. We'll talk about that in a minute. And I'm missing one of them. What is it? Paired sense organs. Paired sense organs, that's the other one. So a left eye and a right eye is the primary thing there. Some of them have left and right nostril structures as well, but anyway, the beginnings of inner ear structures as well, left and right. So the beginning of paired sense organs here in the craniates. So let's talk about neural crest tissue for just a minute. In the development of an embryo, there is a layer of what we consider surface ectoderm initially along the top. This would be right down the middle of the back, I should say this is across the back of a developing embryo, that layer of surface ectoderm. And over time, that layer begins to thicken in a zone in the middle where we're going to form the neural plate. Neural plate. So this would be a cross section. The head might be toward you, the tail might be back behind the board here, but anyway, this is the beginning of the neural plate. That's a cross section of that neural plate. That neural plate then undergoes a change where it becomes what we call a neural groove. So we have a rather thin surface ectoderm, then a thick neural ectoderm layer, and anyway, so there's our neural plate. Now forms a neural groove, and that neural groove is going to continue to come together. Something like this. We still have our surface ectoderm, then we have our neural ectoderm, making more of a tube shape now that's not quite closed in at the very top. Almost closed together there at the top, and it will eventually form a tube that separates from that overlying ectoderm, surface ectoderm. And when it finally does separate from the surface ectoderm to form our neural tube, our surface ectoderm here across the top, our neural tube now separated from it, our brain and spinal cord will form from that neural tube tissue. But there's some tissue that's kind of caught in between, right here at the corners, where that neural tube closed up. And some of that tissue kind of gets caught in between the surface ectoderm and the neural tube tissue right in here, and that is neural crest tissue. Neural crest tissue is very important to our development and becomes a number of important parts of our mature body, our final anatomy. So we'll want to know what that is, and we'll talk about it under the embryology concept, and it will come up again later on in the course as we talk about different organs, especially the nervous system. So anyway, this is how the neural tube forms, the beginning of your brain and spinal cord, and how neural crest develops in that development of the tube. Now back to our chart. The rest of this is not that difficult. Cartilage as a material that helps to make up our cranial skeleton, our neurocranium. I should have just labeled that instead of cranial skeleton, neurocranium. Anyway, and paired sense organs, that's an easy enough feature to understand. 2 eyes, beginning of inner ear structures, 2 inner ears, sometimes paired nostrils, left and right nostrils in there. So that's the beginning of the craniate group. And what is our example of the craniate group there? Our most primitive form of craniate is the hagfish. The hagfish. So we've got urochordates, cephalochordates. Our first craniate is the hagfish. Our next group up the list here is going to be the lamprey. And for our lamprey, this is the first time right here where we're going to see the feature of vertebrae. Vertebrae. So the first evidences of vertebrae come there with the lamprey. Moving on beyond the lamprey up to the next group. Remember, our hagfish and our lamprey are both what we call jawless fishes. They don't have jaws, so we need to put jaws in there. So right here we're going to put jaws. Anything that has jaws is considered a gnathostome, Gnathostome. It just means jawed mouth, the gnathostomes here. So our primitive example of jawed fish, our first example of jawed fish on our chart, are the chondrichthyan fish. I'll just put chondrichthyes there. Those are the sharks, skates, rays, ratfish. All of those things are primitive jawed fish, the chondrichthyan fish, our first group of jawed fish. The next thing we add to our chart as we head up the trail here, our next important feature to be added to our anatomy, we're going to call it an air bladder. In many fish, it's considered the air bladder or swim bladder. In other organisms, it can be considered a lung. So it's the lung or swim bladder, basically the same structure, whichever you want to call it. So we see it for the first time here. So sharks don't have it, lampreys, hagfish don't have it. So none of these have that air bladder develop off of the pharynx, off the wall of the pharynx. So this is the first time we see that feature. And it's in the ray-finned fishes, the Actinopterygii. Actinopterygian fishes, the ray-finned fishes. Now the next group up is going to add a fleshy fin base. Fleshy fin base. So there's a little bit of muscle that extends out into the fin to help move that fin around. These are the Sarcopterygian fishes. Sarcopterygians, lobe-finned fishes or fleshy-finned fishes, lobe-finned or fleshy-finned fishes. Sarcopterygians. We only have like 5 species of those on the Earth's surface that we refer to these days. The coelacanth is the one example, and then all your different lungfish varieties. So I guess there are a few species of the different groups of lungfish. But anyway, only a couple of coelacanths and about 5 species of lungfish make up that group, the lobe-finned fishes or Sarcopterygians. The next characteristic on our chart we need to bring out here, next one right here. We're going to call these tetrapods. So 4 legs. It's the first time we see structures that hold up the animal for movement on land that we consider legs. Beginning of the tetrapod group. And our most primitive tetrapod group up here is going to be the amphibians. Amphibians right here. The next addition on our list as we head toward the top, separating this group from everything below it, down here. There are a couple of things. The amniotic egg is one of the most important. Amniotic egg, so all these are considered amniotes. Make that note here, amniotes. All of these, so the amniotic egg. Also the existence of epidermal scales. Now, you know fish have scales, but they're not epidermal. They're dermal scales. So the first time we see epidermal scales is up here with the amniotes. Let me check and make sure I didn't leave anything off there. Looks like we're good there. So that group, amniotic egg, epidermal scales, all that, this is the first time we see that. That's the reptiles. Reptiles, okay? Now, I'm not going to put birds in here as a separate group on our chart. Birds are now usually grouped with the reptiles. They're just feathered. They have feathers, so that's the main trait that separates birds from other reptiles in our modern taxonomy. If it has feathers, we can call it a bird. There's some confusion about that maybe for some, but for us it's going to work just fine. So, the next point of divergence up here, the last lineage, we're going to lead to the mammals, to the mammalia. So the traits that are going to be important here in separating the mammals, the existence of hair, mammary glands, and 3 middle ear bones are characters we can point to here that separate from mammalia, the mammals from all other groups. So let's go back through this. Our most primitive chordate form, so this is all chordata here, all of the chordata. Urochordates don't have somites or segmental nerves in their structure. We know that all the chordates have a dorsal hollow nerve tube, they have a notochord, they have pharyngeal gill arrangement structure for pharyngeal supports there. So anyway, all of these have that, the urochordates included. But then somites and segmental nerves are not shared between the urochordates and cephalochordates. Cephalochordates have it. Next, in our phylogenetic chart, the development of the cranial structure, the neurocranium. Need cartilage for that. Neural crest tissue develops for the first time, and paired sense organs we talked about. So that leads to the hagfish. Between the hagfish and the lamprey, we see the beginning of vertebral structures. In the lamprey, those vertebral structures are very minute, very insignificant almost in the overall structure of the animal, but we do see some solid material develop in there, the beginning of vertebral structures. So none of these have jaws down here, so we're going to have the first jawed fishes, the gnathostomes, the chondrichthyan fishes, the sharks, skates, and rays have that. But they do not have an air bladder, a swim bladder. The higher bony fishes have that, the actinopterygians. When I talk about actinopterygians, the ray-fin fishes, we think primarily about goldfish, bass, trout. Most of the fish that we see in the ocean are going to be of that type, right? Then there are those that have the fleshy fin base, with sarcopterygian fishes. Sarco refers to muscle. Pterygian, that refers to the fin. So muscle fin, the fleshy fin base, muscle in their fin. Again, that's your coelacanth and lungfish groups have that. Then beyond that, tetrapods, things that have 4 legs. Talk about our amphibians there. Next, above that, amniotic egg and epidermal scales we see in reptiles, birds, and mammals, right? So the reptiles are our next group on our list. Then hair, mammary glands, and 3 middle ear bones separate our mammals from the birds and reptiles. So that's a general overview, and you need to be familiar with these features and where they apply to this chart and how the different groups are positioned in this basic phylogenetic chart of the chordates.